Charleston County, South Carolina, September 1847. When the servants finally broke down the master bedroom door of Bellwood Manor, they discovered Colonel Augustus Van Dorn seated at his dining table. A fork was in his hand, and he was staring at an elaborate silver platter placed before him. He had been dead for 3 days. The coroner's report, sealed by order of the state legislature and locked away for 97 years, described what was on that platter in clinical detail. It was so disturbing that archivists still refuse to discuss it. But the most unsettling detail wasn't what killed the colonel. It was the elderly house servant found kneeling beside him, her hands folded in prayer, repeating the same phrase over and over. "I served him faithful. 30 years faithful, just like she asked." What the authorities discovered in the manor's hidden rooms would force them to rewrite everything they thought they knew about one of Charleston's most respected families. Before we continue with the story of Dinah Colebrook and the Van Dorn family tragedy, we need you to join this community. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one, buried by history itself, deserve to be told. Leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our truth seekers are gathering. What happened at Bellwood Manor that September didn't begin with a death. It began 3 decades earlier with a promise. A promise made in blood and witnessed by no one. Charleston in 1817 represented everything the young American republic aspired to become. The city's white-columned mansions rose like monuments to prosperity along the Ashley River. Their manicured gardens stretched toward cypress swamps that marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. The Van Dorn family occupied the highest tier of this carefully constructed society. Their wealth was built on rice plantations that stretched across 3 counties and on the labor of 200 enslaved people, whose names appeared only in ledgers and bills of sale. Augustus Van Dorn married Constance Pritchard in the spring of 1816, uniting 2 of Charleston's founding families in a ceremony that lasted 3 days and cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. Constance brought a dowry of land and reputation. Augustus brought ambition wrapped in gentleman's clothes. He was 32. She was 19. Their union was considered perfect by every measure that society recognized. The only person who seemed to harbor doubts was a house servant named Dinah Colebrook, purchased by the Van Dorn family when she was just 8 years old. By 1817, Dinah had served the household for 15 years, working her way from kitchen duty to the position of Constance's personal maid. Throughout Charleston's servant network, she was known as uncommonly intelligent, literate despite laws forbidding it, and fiercely devoted to her young mistress. Other servants whispered that Constance had taught Dinah to read using her own childhood primers, a dangerous gift that could result in severe punishment if discovered. Bellwood Manor stood 3 miles from Charleston proper, far enough to maintain privacy but close enough to project power. The main house featured 22 rooms, including a library holding over 3,000 volumes, a music room with a pianoforte imported from Vienna, and a dining room designed to seat 30 guests beneath crystal chandeliers shipped from France. Separate buildings housed the kitchen, laundry, and servant quarters, a small city dedicated to maintaining the illusion of effortless gentility. The manor's location offered certain advantages beyond aesthetics. The property bordered the Ashley River on one side and thick maritime forest on the other. The nearest neighbor lived a half-mile away, separated by dense vegetation that made the Van Dorn estate feel isolated despite its proximity to the city. This isolation, which Augustus praised as providing peaceful contemplation, would later prove significant in ways no one anticipated. Dinah occupied a small room attached to the main house, a privilege granted to upper servants. Her quarters consisted of a narrow bed, a wooden chest for her few possessions, and a window overlooking the herb garden. Other servants occupied the quarters building, but Dinah's position required her to remain close to her mistress at all times, day and night. This arrangement struck some as unusual. Personal maids typically returned to the quarters after evening duties, but Constance insisted, claiming she suffered from nightmares and needed Dinah nearby for comfort. The truth, which Dinah would later reveal in testimony that was immediately suppressed, was darker than anyone suspected. Augustus Van Dorn presented a careful face to Charleston society. He attended Christ Church every Sunday, served on the boards of charitable organizations, and spoke eloquently about his responsibilities as a Christian slaveholder to civilize and convert those under his care. His neighbors considered him a model plantation owner, progressive in his methods and generous with his profits. Several ministers praised his moral character from their pulpits. Behind the closed doors of Bellwood Manor, a different man emerged. Constance's nightmares weren't dreams. They were Augustus's nightly visits to her bedroom. Visits that left bruises hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars. The sounds that sometimes echoed through the manor's halls after midnight, officially explained as settling floorboards or wind through the chimneys, told a different story to those who understood what they were hearing. Dinah heard everything. Her room shared a wall with Constance's bedroom, separated by plaster thin enough to transmit whispers. She heard her mistress's muffled cries, Augustus's slurred demands, the crash of furniture, and the long silences that followed. She heard Constance weeping into her pillow when Augustus finally left, heard her mistress pray for death or deliverance, or simply the strength to survive another day. And Dinah could do nothing. Speaking out meant certain death, probably preceded by torture meant to serve as an example to other servants. Even hinting at the truth to other household staff would risk Constance's life. Augustus's brutality grew worse when he suspected his wife of disloyalty, and confiding in servants would constitute betrayal in his eyes. So Dinah learned to move silently through the manor like a ghost, anticipating her mistress's needs before they were spoken, maintaining the fiction of a harmonious household while watching Constance fade like a flower cut from its stem. She learned which herbs helped Constance sleep through the pain, which poultices reduced swelling, which teas eased the bleeding that sometimes lasted for days. She learned to lie convincingly to the physician Augustus summoned whenever injuries couldn't be hidden, reciting stories about falls, clumsy accidents, and her mistress's supposed delicate constitution. Charleston society saw only what it wanted to see, a distinguished gentleman and his refined wife, living proof that Southern civilization represented humanity's highest achievement. They saw Constance's increasing fragility as feminine delicacy, her withdrawal from social engagements as appropriate modesty, her silences as proper submission to her husband's wisdom. They didn't see Dinah carefully washing blood from expensive linens at midnight, or Constance staring for hours at the river, or Augustus's smile growing wider as his wife grew quieter. They didn't notice how Dinah's expression hardened over the years, or how her hands clenched into fists when Augustus passed, or how something behind her eyes began to change from fear to calculation. By 1820, Constance had suffered 3 miscarriages, each one blamed on her weak constitution rather than the beatings that preceded them by days. The physician, Dr. Clement Fairchild, noted in his private journal, discovered only after his death in 1853, that he harbored suspicions about Mrs. Van Dorn's injuries but feared social and professional destruction if he voiced them. He wrote, "What power have I against a man of Colonel Van Dorn's standing? To accuse him would destroy me and help her not at all. Better to tend her injuries and pray for her deliverance, though I fear that deliverance may come only through death." Charleston's social calendar continued its relentless cycle. The Van Dorns hosted parties where guests praised Constance's grace while she moved among them like a beautiful ghost. Augustus held court in his library, discussing philosophy and religion with other planters while sipping imported brandy. Dinah served tea with steady hands and downcast eyes, her mind cataloguing every detail, every cruelty, every injustice that the fine ladies and gentlemen chose not to see. Something was building behind Dinah's careful servant's mask. Something patient and precise and utterly devoted to the young woman who had shown her kindness in a world designed to crush them both. The other servants began to notice subtle changes. How Dinah would pause sometimes when handling Augustus's food, staring at his plate with an expression that made them uncomfortable. How she spent hours in the herb garden cultivating plants that no one requested. How she asked strange questions about poisons during casual conversations, then claimed she was concerned about rats in the kitchen. No one reported these observations to Augustus. The unspoken code among servants protected their own, and everyone loved Constance even as they feared her husband. If Dinah was planning something, most of them hoped she would succeed. But Dinah wasn't planning anything yet. She was waiting for the right moment, the right method, the right circumstances that would allow her to act without immediate discovery. She had learned patience through years of silent suffering, and she would need every ounce of that patience for what was slowly taking shape in her mind. The summer of 1820 brought unusual heat to the low country. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees for weeks, turning the rice fields into shimmering mirrors and making even simple movement exhausting. The heat frayed tempers throughout Charleston, leading to duels, domestic violence, and several deaths attributed to heat stroke. At Bellwood Manor, the oppressive weather seemed to amplify everything, including Augustus's cruelty and Dinah's growing desperation. On August 17, 1820, Constance Van Doren tried to kill herself. Dinah found her mistress in the bathing room just after dawn, lying in a copper tub filled with water turned pink with blood. Constance had used a straight razor to open both wrists, the cuts deep and purposeful, the kind that comes from genuine determination rather than a cry for help. Dinah moved with swift efficiency born from years of crisis management. She pulled Constance from the tub, wrapped her wrists with strips torn from her own shift, and applied pressure while screaming for help. The other servants came running, and together they managed to slow the bleeding enough for Dr. Fairchild to arrive and complete the work. Augustus was away in Columbia on political business, a fortunate circumstance that gave them time to clean up the worst evidence. Dr. Fairchild, his hand still shaking as he sutured Constance's wrists, looked at Dinah with eyes that held both pity and terrible understanding. "Why?" he asked quietly, though they both knew he wasn't asking why Constance had tried to die. "She can't take no more," Dinah replied, her voice steady despite the blood soaking her clothes. "She been asking the Lord to take her. I guess she decided to help him along." The physician nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone present. He turned to the assembled servants and spoke in a low, urgent voice. Mrs. Van Doren fell while bathing. The tub overturned, and she struck her wrists against broken porcelain. That is what happened. That is what you will say if anyone asks. Do you understand? They understood. They understood Dr. Fairchild was protecting Constance from the legal and social consequences of attempted suicide, which would result in her commitment to an asylum and complete loss of what little autonomy she possessed. They understood that he was also protecting them from Augustus's rage if the truth emerged. And they understood, though no one spoke it aloud, that the doctor knew exactly why Constance had wanted to die. Constance survived, though *survived* seemed too generous a word for her condition afterward. She lay in her bed for 3 weeks, staring at the ceiling with empty eyes, speaking to no one, eating only when Dinah forced small spoonfuls of broth between her lips. The scars on her wrists were angry red marks that would fade to white but never disappear, permanent reminders of her desperation. Augustus returned from Columbia, full of energy and political gossip, barely noticing his wife's deteriorated state. When he finally acknowledged her condition, he accepted Dr. Fairchild's lie about the bathing accident with barely a question. Either he believed it, or he simply didn't care enough to investigate further. He complained about the expense of the physician's extended care, grumbled about Constance's weakness, and resumed his normal routines as if nothing had happened. But something had changed in Dinah. As she sat beside Constance's bed during those long recovery days, reading aloud from books of poetry or simply holding her mistress's hand, a cold clarity settled over her like frost. Her mistress had tried to escape through death and failed. The physician knew the truth but was powerless to act. Charleston society would continue pretending everything was fine. The law offered no protection. God, if he existed, appeared uninterested in intervening. Which meant that if Constance was to find any relief, Dinah would have to provide it herself. The thought crystallized slowly, taking shape over weeks of careful consideration. *murder. The word felt simultaneously foreign and inevitable in Dinah's mind. She turned it over carefully, examining it from every angle, testing its weight. She had never killed anything larger than a chicken, and even that made her queasy. But she had also watched her beloved mistress bleed out in a bathtub, had seen the desperation in Constance's eyes, had heard her pray for death night after night. The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. Augustus was a large, strong man in excellent health. He carried pistols when he traveled and kept rifles in his study. His position in society meant his death would trigger intense investigation. And if Dinah was caught, her execution would be slow and public, designed to terrorize other enslaved people into absolute submission. But Dinah had advantages, too. She was invisible. Servants always were to men like Augustus. She had access to his food, his drink, his private spaces. She was literate and had read extensively from the Van Dorn Library, including medical texts and botanical guides. She knew which plants growing wild in the South Carolina Low Country could kill, and which could do so while mimicking natural illness. Most importantly, she had time. Augustus was only 36 years old, likely to live for decades more. Decades of torturing Constance, decades of bruises and blood and despair, unless someone stopped him. Dinah began her education in death with the same methodical care she brought to all her duties. She studied the medical books in Augustus's library during the few hours she had to herself, learning about diseases common to the region: malaria, yellow fever, cholera, typhoid. She memorized symptoms, timelines, mortality rates. She noted which illnesses progressed slowly versus quickly, which prompted physicians to order autopsies, which were so common that they rarely warranted deep investigation. She expanded her herb garden, claiming she was developing remedies for common ailments. The other servants appreciated her efforts. Her poultices genuinely helped with minor injuries and illnesses. Augustus never noticed the additional plants. Why would he? The garden was servants' business, beneath his attention. Among the medicinal herbs, Dinah cultivated other species. White snake root, which caused trembles and could be mistaken for various wasting diseases. Foxglove, whose digitalis affected the heart in ways that mimicked natural cardiac failure. Oleander, beautiful and deadly, growing wild throughout the Low Country. She learned their properties, their dosages, their effects. But she didn't act. Not yet. Because rushing would mean discovery, and discovery would mean failure, and failure would leave Constance alone with Augustus forever. Constance slowly recovered from her suicide attempt, though she remained fragile in ways that went beyond the physical. She barely spoke except to Dinah, and even then only in whispers. She moved through the manor like a ghost haunting the scene of its own death. At night, when Augustus came to her room, Dinah heard her mistress's prayers. Asterisk, please, God. Please let it end. Please let me go. Asterisk. Those prayers became Dinah's purpose. If God wouldn't answer, she would answer in his place. She would become the instrument of Constance's deliverance, whatever the cost to her own soul. The years between 1820 and 1847 passed with terrible slowness at Bellwood Manor. Each day was a repetition of the last in a cycle of genteel horror that Charleston society continued to ignore. But beneath the surface of those seemingly unchanging years, two parallel transformations were taking place: Constance Van Dorn's slow dissolution, and Dinah Colebrook's careful preparation for murder. Constance aged rapidly after her failed suicide attempt. The young woman who had married Augustus at 19 became unrecognizable by 30. Her hair turned grey at the temples, then spread until she looked 20 years older than her actual age. Her skin took on a papery quality, stretched too tight over bones that became more prominent as she ate less and less. The monthly beatings continued with mechanical regularity, though Augustus seemed almost bored by them now, administering violence with the same casual attention he gave to business correspondence. She stopped leaving the manor entirely after 1825, claiming illness. Charleston society clucked sympathetically about her delicate constitution, while privately whispering about her strangeness, her reclusiveness, her failure to produce an heir. Some suggested Augustus should set her aside and remarry. Surely God wouldn't object to a man seeking a healthy wife who could bear children. Augustus deflected these suggestions with public displays of devotion that made Dinah's stomach turn. Dr. Fairchild visited regularly, prescribing tonics and rest. His eyes always avoiding Dinah's, because they both knew the truth he refused to speak. He noted Constance's declining health in his journal with clinical detachment that barely concealed his guilt. Asterisk, Mrs. V continues her deterioration. No physical cause can be determined. I suspect the root is spiritual or mental, but such diagnoses remain beyond my expertise. I have failed her completely. Asterisk. But while Constance faded, Dinah grew stronger. Not physically, the years of labor and stress were taking their toll on her body as well, but in purpose and knowledge. She transformed herself into a scholar of death, studying every method of killing that might escape detection in 1840s South Carolina. She learned that arsenic, the murder weapon of choice in popular novels, left distinctive traces in the body and prompted immediate suspicion. She learned that most plant poisons produce symptoms too dramatic and unusual to pass as natural illness. She learned that quick deaths triggered investigations while slow ones often went unquestioned, especially if the victim was known to be in poor health. She also learned about Augustus in ways that he never suspected. She observed his habits, his preferences, his routines. She knew that he drank exactly 3 glasses of brandy every evening in his study, that he insisted his meat be cooked rare, that he had developed a taste for oysters brought fresh from Charleston markets every Friday. She knew that he suffered from gout that he refused to acknowledge publicly, that his eyesight was beginning to fail though he wouldn't admit it, that he sometimes experienced chest pains he attributed to indigestion. Most importantly, she learned about the secret room. Bellwood Manor held many secrets in its walls, but this was the deepest. Behind a bookcase in Augustus's study, accessible only through a hidden latch, lay a small chamber perhaps 10 feet square. Dinah discovered it by accident in 1828 while cleaning, seeing Augustus emerge from what appeared to be solid wall. She waited until he left for Charleston, then found the mechanism and explored the space. What she found there confirmed every terrible suspicion she'd harbored. A chair with leather restraints. Chains attached to the wall. Instruments whose purposes she didn't want to imagine but understood anyway. And journals, dozens of leather-bound journals in which Augustus had recorded his activities with disturbing clinical detail. Dinah read them all. Every page, every entry, every description of what he'd done to Constance, and in earlier years to enslaved women whose names appeared only once in his meticulous records before they disappeared from the plantation entirely. The journals revealed a man who had systematically transformed cruelty into a science, documenting his experiments in causing pain with the same careful attention other men brought to agriculture or business. She memorized passages without meaning to, words searing themselves into her brain. Asterisk subject shows remarkable resilience. Increased pressure to the ribs until I heard the crack. Her eyes quite beautiful in their terror. Asterisk the entries went back years, predating his marriage, revealing that Constance wasn't Augustus's first victim, merely his most permanent one. Dinah carefully returned everything to its exact position, locked the room, and spent the next 3 days vomiting whenever she thought about what she'd read. But the discovery crystallized her resolve. Augustus Van Dorn wasn't just a cruel husband. He was a monster wearing a gentleman's mask, and he would continue his tortures until someone stopped him. The question was no longer whether to kill him, but how to kill him in a way that wouldn't be discovered and wouldn't implicate Constance. Because Dinah had realized something crucial, if Augustus died under suspicious circumstances, Constance would be the primary suspect. Wife murders husband. It happened often enough to have established legal precedent. And if Constance were convicted, Dinah would be called as a witness and probably executed as an accomplice. No, Augustus's death had to appear completely natural. It had to emerge from his own body's failure. Something that could happen to any man in his 40s who worked too hard and indulged too much. Heart failure, stroke, sudden seizure, something that would prompt sadness rather than suspicion, that would allow Constance to become the tragic widow rather than the accused murderer. Dinah spent years researching, planning, discarding ideas, and developing new ones. She couldn't use anything that would appear in an autopsy if one were ordered. She couldn't risk any method that might produce symptoms before Augustus could consume a lethal dose. She needed something that would accumulate slowly, that would weaken him gradually until his body simply gave out, that would be attributed to middle age and natural decline. She finally found her answer in 1835, in a medical text discussing the treatment of heart conditions with digitalis extracted from foxglove. The book explained how the substance strengthened failing hearts in small, controlled doses, but also noted that accumulated exposure caused the heart to become irregular and could lead to sudden cardiac arrest. The book warned physicians to monitor dosage carefully, as digitalis remained in the body for extended periods and could build to toxic levels even with consistent small doses. It was perfect. Augustus had already begun showing signs of heart trouble, the chest pains he dismissed as indigestion, the shortness of breath he attributed to hot weather, the occasional palpitations he refused to acknowledge. If his heart failed, even a thorough autopsy would likely attribute it to natural progression of cardiac disease. And digitalis occurred naturally in foxglove, which grew wild throughout South Carolina. There would be no suspicious purchases, no evidence of procurement, nothing to trace. But Dinah still didn't act, because she'd realized something else. She needed Constance's permission. Not explicit permission that would make her mistress culpable, but some sign that Constance wanted Augustus dead, that she would accept the consequences of his death, that she wouldn't be destroyed by guilt afterward. That sign came on a humid June evening in 1838. Augustus had been particularly brutal the night before, and Constance lay in her bed with bruises darkening her throat where he'd choked her until she lost consciousness. Dinah sat beside her as usual, applying cool compresses, when Constance suddenly gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Dinah," she whispered, her voice raw from damage to her throat. "Do you ever think about killing him?" The question hung in the air between them. Dinah's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yes," she finally answered. "Every day." Constance closed her eyes. A single tear traced down her cheek. "Me, too," she breathed. "But I'm too weak. I've tried and failed. I can't do it myself. I know, if someone were to, if he were to die, I would grieve as a widow should grieve." Constance's eyes opened, meeting Dinah's directly. "But inside, I would be glad. Do you understand me, Dinah?" "Yes, I understand. And if that person were caught, I would swear I knew nothing. I would protect them however I could. I understand, Constance squeezed Dinah's hand once more, then released it. Neither of them spoke of it again. They didn't need to. Permission had been granted and received. A conspiracy formed without explicit acknowledgement, a pact sealed in the space between words. But Dinah still waited. Because she'd learned patience through years of service, and because she knew that the most effective plans were the ones executed without haste. She continued cultivating her foxglove, extracting its essence in small batches that she stored in unmarked bottles in her quarters. She continued observing Augustus, noting his health, his habits, his vulnerabilities. She continued being the perfect invisible servant, while inside, murder took root and grew. Like any good hunter, she was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment would come nearly a decade later, prompted by something she couldn't have anticipated, Constance's deteriorating condition reaching a critical point that forced Dinah to act before her mistress died from years of accumulated damage, leaving Augustus free to find another victim. But before that moment arrived, another element would enter the story, one that would complicate everything and transform Dinah's planned mercy killing into something far stranger and more terrible than she'd ever imagined. The summer of 1846 brought changes to Bellwood Manor that seemed minor at first but would prove crucial to what followed. Augustus, now 62 years old and showing his age despite his vigor, hired a new overseer for the rice fields, a taciturn man named Silas Gentry, who had managed plantations throughout the Low Country and came with excellent references. Gentry moved into the overseer's cottage on the property's edge and began implementing new farming methods designed to increase yields. Gentry's arrival meant Augustus spent more time away from the main house, riding out to the fields to inspect progress and engage in the technical discussions of rice cultivation that obsessed wealthy planters. These absences gave Constance and Dinah precious hours of peace, moments when the manor felt almost normal, almost like a home rather than a prison. During one of these peaceful interludes, Dinah noticed something alarming. Constance had begun coughing blood. Not much at first, just flecks on her handkerchief after coughing spells. But the amount increased over the following weeks, and Constance's breathing became increasingly labored. She was dying. Dinah realized with growing horror. Not from Augustus's violence, but from consumption, tuberculosis, that had likely been incubating for years, accelerated by her weakened constitution. Dr. Fairchild confirmed the diagnosis in July, his face grave as he delivered the news. Consumption was incurable, he explained. Some patients lingered for years, but in Constance's already fragile state, he gave her perhaps 12 months, possibly less. He prescribed rest, fresh air, and nutritious food, remedies they all knew were essentially useless. Augustus received the news with barely concealed irritation. A dying wife was inconvenient, requiring care and medical expenses while providing nothing in return. He complained about the cost of Dr. Fairchild's visits, grumbled about Constance's weakness, and made increasingly less effort to hide his cruelty. What did it matter if he left bruises on a woman already dying? Who would care? The diagnosis changed everything for Dinah. She'd spent years planning the perfect murder, but consumption was killing Constance faster than Dinah could kill Augustus. If her mistress died first, Dinah's entire purpose would evaporate. She would be left with nothing but her rage and grief, and Augustus would likely sell her or give her to another family member, removing her from the only place she'd ever known. Worse, if Constance died first, Augustus would be free to remarry. Some young, unsuspecting woman would become his next victim, and the cycle would begin again. Dinah had read his journals. She knew he needed someone to hurt, that the cruelty wasn't about Constance specifically, but about power itself. Without a wife, he would turn his attention more fully to the enslaved women on the plantation, as his earlier journals revealed he'd done before marriage. Dinah had to act now, not in months or years, but now, while Constance still lived to see Augustus die, while justice, such as it was, could still be served. She began administering Digitalis in September 1846, adding carefully measured drops to Augustus's evening brandy. The dosage was so small that it produced no immediate effects, just a slight irregularity in his heartbeat that he wouldn't notice, a barely perceptible increase in fatigue that he would attribute to age or work stress. But Digitalis accumulated in the body, building slowly toward the critical threshold where the heart would simply stop. Dinah had calculated that it would take approximately 6 months for the poison to reach lethal levels. 6 months of steady, undetectable doses. 6 months of watching Augustus weaken gradually, naturally, in ways that would alarm no one. By her calculations, he would suffer his fatal cardiac event sometime in March 1847, assuming everything went according to plan. But life at Bellwood Manor rarely went according to plan. Augustus's health did decline through the fall and winter, exactly as Dinah had predicted. He complained of tiredness, which everyone attributed to his age and the demanding schedule he maintained. His appetite decreased slightly. His sleep became restless. Dr. Fairchild, visiting primarily to tend to Constance, examined Augustus at the colonel's request and pronounced him fundamentally healthy, suggesting he reduce his brandy consumption and get more rest. The irony of prescribing less brandy, the very delivery mechanism for the poison, wasn't lost on Dinah, but Augustus ignored the advice anyway, maintaining his 3-glass-per-evening ritual with religious devotion. What Dinah didn't anticipate was Augustus's growing paranoia as his health declined. He began to suspect that Constance was somehow responsible for his symptoms, some kind of slow poisoning, perhaps revenge for years of suffering. The suspicion was absurd on its surface. Constance barely had strength to leave her bed, let alone procure and administer poison. But Augustus's journals revealed a mind increasingly disconnected from reality, convinced that his dying wife was orchestrating some elaborate revenge plot. In January 1847, Augustus confronted Constance directly. Dinah was in the room folding linens when he stormed in without his usual evening announcement. "You're trying to kill me," he declared, his voice shaking with rage or fear or some combination of both. "I see it in your eyes. You want me dead." Constance, propped up on pillows and struggling to breathe, managed a weak laugh. "Augustus," she rasped, "I've wanted you dead for 20 years, but I couldn't manage it. I'm too weak." "You made sure of that." The admission should have enraged him, but instead, it seemed to deflate something inside him. He stood there, this man who'd terrorized his wife for decades, looking suddenly old and uncertain. "Then who?" he asked quietly. "Someone is doing this to me. I can feel it." "Maybe God," Constance suggested, closing her eyes. Maybe you are finally receiving judgment for your sins. Wouldn't that be fitting? Augustus left without responding, but his paranoia only intensified. He began examining his food before eating, convinced someone was tampering with it. He accused the kitchen staff of attempting to poison him, causing 3 servants to flee the plantation in terror. He started carrying a pistol at all times, even within the house. But he never suspected his evening brandy, which he continued to drink with absolute trust. Why would he? The brandy came from bottles that were sealed, stored in his locked study, poured by his own hand. It was the one thing he was absolutely certain was safe. Dinah modified her plan slightly, reducing the digitalist dosage to account for Augustus's decreased food intake and increasing stress levels. She wanted his death to come naturally, not during one of his paranoid episodes that might prompt suspicious investigations. Patience *, she reminded herself constantly. Just a few more weeks. But Constance was deteriorating faster than anticipated. By February, she was coughing blood constantly, her breathing reduced to shallow gasps. Dr. Fairchild privately told Dinah that the end was likely weeks away, possibly days. Make her comfortable, he advised, pressing a small bottle of laudanum into Dinah's hands. When the pain becomes too much, give her this. As much as she needs. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Dinah understood. The physician was giving her permission to ease Constance's death when the suffering became unbearable, even if that meant administering a lethal dose of opiate. It was a mercy he couldn't offer publicly but could facilitate privately, trusting Dinah to know when the time came. Constance knew she was dying. She'd known for months. What she didn't know was whether Augustus would die first, whether she would live long enough to see Dinah's plan succeed. The uncertainty tormented her in ways the consumption didn't. Promise me, she whispered to Dinah one evening in early March, her voice barely audible. Promise me you'll finish what you started. Promise me he won't outlive me. I promise, Dinah replied, gripping her mistress's hand. I swear it on my life. He will die before you do. It was a promise she would keep, though not in the way either of them expected. On March 12, 1847, Augustus Van Dorn experienced his first obvious cardiac episode. He was in his study reviewing ledgers when his heart suddenly began racing uncontrollably. He described it later to Dr. Fairchild as feeling like a bird was trapped in his chest, beating its wings frantically against his ribs. The episode lasted perhaps 90 seconds, then resolved as suddenly as it had begun, leaving him shaking and covered in cold sweat. Dr. Fairchild examined him thoroughly and found his heartbeat irregular, sometimes racing, sometimes slowing to an alarming degree. The physician prescribed complete rest, no alcohol, and no stress, advice that was completely impractical for a man like Augustus. When Fairchild privately asked Dinah about Augustus's habits and diet, she described his routine honestly, omitting only the digitalist she'd been adding to his brandy for 6 months. The cardiac episode should have frightened Augustus into following medical advice, but instead it intensified his paranoia. He became convinced that the attack was evidence of poisoning, that someone, probably multiple someones, were conspiring to kill him. He began sleeping with his pistol under his pillow, startling awake at every sound, accusing servants of plots that existed only in his increasingly fragmented mind. Dinah watched this deterioration with mixed feelings. On one hand, Augustus's decline was proceeding exactly as she'd planned. His heart was failing, slowly but inevitably, in ways that would be attributed to natural causes. On the other hand, his paranoia was making him unpredictable and dangerous, a wounded animal lashing out at shadows. Constance, meanwhile, was barely conscious most of the time. Dinah administered laudanum regularly to ease her pain, and her mistress drifted through waking dreams, sometimes lucid, sometimes speaking to people who weren't there. During her clear moments, she would grip Dinah's hand and whisper the same question, "Is he dead yet?" "Soon," Dinah would reply. "Very soon." But soon was becoming increasingly uncertain. Augustus's heart was failing, but his sheer stubbornness seemed to be keeping him alive through force of will. Dinah couldn't increase the digitalist dosage without risking symptoms so obvious they'd trigger an autopsy. She was trapped in her own carefully constructed timeline, watching her mistress die while waiting for Augustus to follow. Then, on March 19th, something happened that changed everything. Dinah was in the kitchen preparing Augustus's dinner when she heard a commotion from Constance's bedroom. She rushed upstairs to find her mistress sitting up in bed, something she hadn't been able to do for weeks, with blood streaming from her mouth, more blood than Dinah had ever seen. Constance was trying to speak, but only gurgling sounds emerged as she drowned in her own fluids. Dr. Fairchild arrived within an hour, but there was nothing he could do. Constance was hemorrhaging internally, her tuberculosis-ravaged lungs finally giving way completely. She would die within hours, possibly minutes. The physician prepared a massive dose of morphine and handed it to Dinah. "She's suffering," he said simply. "End it mercifully." But before Dinah could administer the morphine, Constance's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping Dinah's wrist. Her mistress's eyes were clear, clearer than they'd been in months, burning with desperate intensity. She pulled Dinah close, so close that Dinah could feel Constance's blood-warm breath against her ear, and whispered 5 words that would echo through the next century of suppressed history. Make him eat my heart. Dinah jerked back, certain she'd misheard. But Constance's grip tightened, her fingernails digging into Dinah's wrist hard enough to draw blood. She repeated the words, clearer this time, each syllable deliberate, "Make him eat my heart." "I don't," Dinah began, but Constance cut her off with a violent shake of her head. "He ate my soul alive," Constance rasped, more blood bubbling from her lips. "For 30 years he consumed me, piece by piece. Now he can eat what's left." The physical truth of what he did. She coughed, spraying blood across the white sheets. "Promise me, Dinah. Make him know what he devoured. Make him eat it." Dr. Fairchild, standing at the foot of the bed, had gone pale. "Mrs. Van Dorn, you're delirious," he said weakly. "The fever?" "I'm dying, not delirious," Constance snapped with more force than she'd shown in years. "I know exactly what I'm saying." She turned back to Dinah. "You promised me he'd die before I did. But I can feel death coming now, and he's still alive. So give me this. Make him face what he destroyed. Make him consume it literally, as he did metaphorically. Promise me." Dinah looked into her mistress's eyes and saw something she'd never seen before. Not pain, not fear, not even hatred, but a kind of terrible, transcendent fury that had been building for 3 decades and was finally demanding expression. This wasn't a request born from fever or confusion. This was Constance Van Dorn, who had endured unspeakable cruelty with grace and silence, finally claiming the only revenge available to her. "I promise," Dinah whispered. Constance smiled, actually smiled, for the first time Dinah could remember in years. Then she released Dinah's wrist, closed her eyes, and allowed the morphine to take her away from a life that had been nothing but suffering. She died 17 minutes later, at 8 p.m., with Dinah holding one hand and Dr. Fairchild holding the other. The physician, shaking, closed her eyes and pulled the sheet over her face. Then he turned to Dinah with an expression of absolute horror. "What she asked," he said carefully, "is impossible. Illegal. Sacrilegious. Utterly mad. You cannot, you must not. Did you hear her ask anything?" Dinah interrupted, meeting his eyes steadily. The physician stared at her for a long moment, then slowly, he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I heard nothing. The poor woman was delirious at the end. Tragic. Truly tragic." He packed his medical bag with trembling hands. "I'll return in the morning to prepare the death certificate. The funeral should be held within 3 days, given the consumption. I trust you'll prepare the body appropriately." "Yes, sir. I'll take care of everything." Dr. Fairchild left, and Dinah stood alone in the room with her dead mistress. Augustus hadn't come to Constance's bedside. He was in his study, drinking brandy and reviewing plantation accounts, apparently unconcerned that his wife was dying 50 feet away. He would be informed of her death in due time. For now, Dinah had work to do. The promise she'd made was monstrous. It violated every religious principle, every law, every basic human decency. It was also, Dinah realized, the most perfect revenge imaginable. Augustus had spent 30 years literally destroying Constance, breaking her bones, crushing her spirit, consuming her identity and autonomy until nothing remained. Now, through an act of appalling literalism, he would be forced to face the physical manifestation of his cruelty. But more than that, it would destroy him in ways simple murder never could. Augustus was a pillar of Charleston society, a church elder, a man who prided himself on civilization and Christian virtue. If he could be tricked into consuming human flesh, his own wife's flesh, it would shatter his self-image so completely that even if he survived physically, he would be destroyed spiritually and psychologically. Dinah had been planning to kill him with poison. Constance had given her something far more devastating, the truth, served as a meal he could never digest. She worked through the night with surgical precision, motivated by love for her mistress and a cold, methodical fury that had been building for 3 decades. The anatomical details of what she did in that room will not be described here. This is a story about human evil, not gratuitous horror. Sufficient to say that she had medical texts to guide her, sharp kitchen knives for the work, and steady hands that had done difficult tasks before. By dawn, Constance's body was prepared for viewing and burial, dressed in her finest gown, looking almost peaceful. No one examining her would find anything unusual. The funeral traditions of the time didn't require extensive examination of the deceased, and the family physician had already certified consumption as the cause of death. In the kitchen, wrapped in wax paper and stored in the cold cellar, was approximately 1 pound of meat that looked identical to the venison Augustus regularly requested for his meals. Dinah had been careful about the size and preparation. It needed to be indistinguishable from game meat, something Augustus would consume without question. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Bellwood Manor intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Because what Dinah was about to do would become the most suppressed crime in South Carolina history. Augustus took the news of Constance's death with what appeared to be genuine sorrow, though it was difficult to tell if he was mourning his wife or mourning the loss of his primary victim. He made all the appropriate arrangements: funeral at Christ Church, burial in the family plot, obituaries in the Charleston newspapers praising her gentle nature and Christian virtue. He played the devastated widower with such conviction that several women from their social circle wept at his obvious grief. The funeral was held on March 22, 3 days after Constance's death. Augustus stood at graveside with bowed head while the minister praised Constance's patience and devotion. He accepted condolences with quiet dignity. He returned to Bellwood Manor and retreated to his study, claiming he needed solitude to process his loss. That evening, Dinah prepared his dinner: potato soup, fresh bread, and venison steak cooked rare, exactly how he preferred it. She served it to him in his study, where he sat surrounded by ledgers and papers, already beginning to move past his wife's death toward practical concerns of property and estate management. "Thank you, Dinah," he said absently, not looking up from his papers. "You've served this family faithfully for many years." 30 years, sir," Dinah replied, her voice steady. "I've been serving you and Miss Constance for 30 years exactly." "Has it been that long?" Augustus cut into the meat, which was tender and perfectly cooked. "Time passes strangely. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I brought Constance home as my bride." He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. "This is excellent. My compliments to the kitchen. I prepared it myself, sir. Special cut. Very tender. I can taste that." Augustus consumed the entire steak with obvious enjoyment, washing it down with his brandy, which Dinah had prepared with the usual dose of digitalis. When he finished, he leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "That may be the finest venison I've ever had." "Where did we source it?" "Very local, sir. Close to home." Augustus nodded, already turning back to his papers. Dinah collected the empty plate and left the study, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Augustus Van Dorn, pillar of Charleston society and secret monster, had just consumed his wife's heart without knowing it. Constance's revenge was complete. But Dinah's wasn't. Because Augustus was still alive. Still breathing. Still capable of hurting others. The digitalist would kill him eventually. But Dinah found she couldn't wait any longer. She'd promised Constance he would die first, and though her mistress was already gone, the promise still demanded fulfillment. Over the next week, Augustus's health deteriorated rapidly. The cardiac episodes became more frequent and more severe. He complained of nightmares, terrible dreams where Constance stood at the foot of his bed, her chest opened like a grotesque flower, asking him if he'd enjoyed his meal. He woke screaming several times, convinced he could taste blood in his mouth, though Dr. Fairchild found no physical evidence of internal bleeding. It's grief, the physician explained to the household staff. The colonel is experiencing delayed shock at his wife's death. Perfectly natural. He needs rest and time to heal. But Augustus wasn't healing. He was unraveling. The combination of digitalist poisoning, cardiac failure, and psychological horror from the nightmares he couldn't explain was destroying him faster than Dinah had anticipated. He stopped sleeping entirely, afraid of what he might dream. He stopped eating, claiming all food tasted wrong, tasted like meat when it shouldn't, tasted like blood and fear. On March 28, Dinah made a decision. She couldn't let Augustus die slowly, mad and suffering, without knowing *Y*. Constance had wanted him to face what he'd consumed, but he couldn't face it if he didn't know. The revenge would be incomplete if he died in ignorance. She waited until evening, when Augustus was in his study drinking his brandy. He'd resumed this habit despite medical advice, claiming it was the only thing that helped him sleep. Dinah entered carrying his dinner tray, set it before him. Then, instead of leaving as she normally would, she stood there, hands folded, waiting. "What is it, Dinah?" Augustus asked irritably. "Why are you hovering?" "I got something to tell you, sir. Something you deserve to know before you die." Augustus's head snapped up. "Before I die? What are you talking about?" "You're dying, sir. Been dying for 6 months now. Your heart's failing, getting weaker every day. Dr. Fairchild don't know why, but I do." Dinah's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I've been putting poison in your brandy since September. Just a little bit each time. Not enough to notice, but it builds up inside you. Digitalus, it's called. From foxglove. I grew it myself in the garden." Augustus stared at her, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally settling on something like understanding. "You asterisk," he breathed. "It was you all along." "Yes, sir. Miss Constance wanted you dead. She asked me to do it, though not in words exactly. We had an understanding, her and me." Dinah took a step closer. "But that ain't the worst of it. That ain't what I really came to tell you. There's worse than murder." Augustus tried to laugh, but it came out as a wheeze. His hand moved toward the drawer where he kept his pistol, but Dinah continued speaking, and her words froze him. "You remember that venison I served you the night of Miss Constance's funeral? The tender cut you said was the finest you ever had." Dinah watched his face carefully. "That wasn't venison, sir. That was Miss Constance. Her heart, to be specific. I cut it out myself and cooked it for you, and you ate every bite." The color drained from Augustus's face so completely that for a moment Dinah thought he might faint. "No," he whispered. "That's impossible. You're lying. You're mad." "Miss Constance made me promise," Dinah continued relentlessly. "With her dying breath, she made me swear I'd make you eat her heart. She said you spent 30 years consuming her soul, so you ought to consume her body, too. Make you face the truth of what you done to her literally, instead of just figuratively." "You're lying," Augustus repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. He was remembering the taste of that meat, the dreams that had followed, the sensation of something wrong that he couldn't identify. It was venison. It had to be venison. You can tell yourself that if it helps you sleep, Dinah said. But deep down, you know I'm telling the truth. You can feel it, can't you? That's why you've been having nightmares. That's why food don't taste right anymore. Your body knows what you've done, even if your mind don't want to accept it. Augustus lunged for his pistol with surprising speed for a man in heart failure. But Dinah had anticipated this. She'd positioned herself too far away for him to reach before he'd have to aim and fire, and her words had shaken him too badly for steady aim. He pulled the weapon from the drawer, hands trembling, and pointed it at her. I should kill you right now, he said, his voice shaking as badly as his hands. I should put a bullet through your brain and claim you attacked me. Everyone would believe it. Everyone would understand. Yes, sir, they would, Dinah agreed calmly. But killing me won't change what you did. Won't bring Miss Constance back. Won't take her heart out of your belly. She paused. And it won't stop your own heart from failing. You probably got a few weeks left, maybe less. The poison's already done its work. Shooting me won't save you. Augustus's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Perhaps he realized that killing Dinah would prompt an investigation he couldn't afford. Perhaps he was simply too shocked to act. Or perhaps, on some level, he believed he deserved whatever was coming to him. Why, he finally asked, lowering the pistol slightly. Why tell me this? Why not let me die in ignorance? Because Miss Constance wanted you to know what you consumed, Dinah replied. And because I wanted to see your face when you realized the truth. Wanted to watch you understand that the Christian gentleman, the society leader, the pillar of Charleston, all of that's built on top of a man who's a cannibal. You ate your own wife's heart, sir. You can't ever undo that. You can't ever be clean of it. The pistol slipped from Augustus's fingers and clattered on the desk. He stared at Dinah with an expression that combined horror, hatred, and, surprisingly, a strange kind of respect. You're a monster, he whispered. No, sir, Dinah corrected quietly. I'm a servant who loved her mistress more than she feared death. You're the monster. I just made sure you knew it before you died. She turned and walked toward the door, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet tear through her back. But Augustus didn't pick up the pistol again. He just sat there staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, while Dinah left the study and closed the door behind her. Augustus Van Dorn survived for 6 more days, though survived was too generous a word for his condition. He refused to eat or drink anything except water from sealed bottles. He fired the entire household staff except Dinah, partly because he needed someone to tend to him, partly because her presence seemed to be the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. He spent those days in his study, sometimes writing frantically in his journals, sometimes just staring at the walls. The cardiac episodes came more frequently, each one leaving him weaker than the last. Dr. Fairchild visited daily, increasingly concerned but unable to determine any specific cause for the colonel's rapid decline beyond general heart failure. On April 3, Augustus called Dinah to his study one final time. He looked like a corpse already, his skin gray and waxy, his breathing shallow. I need to know, he rasped. What you said about Constance, did you really do it, or was it just a story to torment me? Dinah met his eyes steadily. What do you think, sir? I think? Augustus paused, struggling for breath. I think it doesn't matter, because even if you lied, I believe it's true. I can feel it inside me, like a weight I'll never be rid of. You destroyed me either way. Miss Constance destroyed you, sir. I just helped. Augustus nodded slowly. Tell me something, he said. Did she hate me at the end? No, sir. Dinah's answer seemed to surprise him. She was beyond hate by then. She just wanted peace. And she wanted you to understand what you'd done to her, even if understanding came too late to matter. It does come too late, Augustus agreed. He reached for a leather-bound journal on his desk and pushed it toward Dinah. My confessions. Everything I did. Everything I am. Burn it. Don't let anyone know the truth. I can't do that, sir. Why not? Because the truth needs to exist somewhere, even if nobody ever reads it. Miss Constance's suffering needs to be written down. Needs to be real in black and white. Otherwise, it's like it never happened. Like she never existed. Dinah picked up the journal. I'll keep it hidden, but I won't destroy it. Augustus seemed to consider arguing, then simply nodded. As you wish. You've earned that right, I suppose. His breathing became more labored. I'm dying now, aren't I? This is the end. Yes, sir. This is the end. Good. Augustus closed his eyes. Tell them I died of a broken heart from losing Constance. Let them think I loved her. It's kinder than the truth. Those were his last words. His heart failed completely 7 minutes later, and this time there was no recovery. Dr. Fairchild, summoned by Dinah, pronounced him dead at 4:47 p.m. on April 3, 1847, and listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest resulting from acute grief and pre-existing heart condition. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was launched. Augustus Van Dorn was buried 3 days later in the family plot next to the wife whose heart he'd unknowingly consumed. Charleston society mourned the loss of such a distinguished gentleman, dead from the unbearable sorrow of losing his beloved bride. Only Dinah knew the truth. And she wasn't telling. The aftermath of Augustus Van Dorn's death unfolded with bureaucratic efficiency that masked the horror lurking beneath the surface. The estate entered probate, revealing that Augustus had died deeply in debt despite appearances of wealth. The rice plantations were sold to cover creditors. The enslaved people, including Dinah, were divided among Augustus's distant relatives as partial payment of debts. Dinah was transferred to Augustus's cousin in Columbia, where she lived for another 18 years in relative peace, serving a family that treated her with indifference rather than cruelty, a vast improvement over life at Bellwood Manor. She never married, never had children, and rarely spoke about her years with the Van Dorns, except to say that she'd served them faithfully. She kept Augustus's journal hidden among her few possessions, wrapped in oilcloth and buried at the bottom of her trunk. She couldn't read it, the contents would have destroyed what little peace she'd found. But she kept it because it was proof that Constance Van Dorn had existed, had suffered, and had been murdered slowly over 30 years by a man the world considered respectable. Dinah died in 1865, just as the Civil War was ending and emancipation was becoming reality throughout the South. She was found in her quarters on the morning of January 16, sitting peacefully in her chair with the journal open on her lap. She died of natural causes, a stroke, the physician said. And she looked, those who found her reported, strangely content. The journal was discovered among her possessions, along with a letter she'd written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular. The letter explained everything: the poison, the heart, the promise to Constance, the revenge that had consumed 30 years of patient waiting. The cousin who inherited Dinah's meager possessions read both documents, immediately understood their implications, and made a decision that would keep the truth hidden for nearly a century. He contacted the family lawyer, who contacted other Van Dorn relatives, who collectively decided that the journal and letter posed an unacceptable threat to the family's reputation. They couldn't destroy the documents. Southern tradition placed great importance on preserving family papers, but they could hide them. The materials were placed in a sealed box, deposited with the family's other papers at the Charleston Historical Society, with instructions that they remain sealed for 100 years. The box was finally opened in 1965 by an archivist named Patricia Oswald, who nearly fainted when she read the contents. She immediately contacted the Historical Society's director, who contacted the Van Dorn family's living descendants, who attempted to have the documents destroyed or resealed. But by 1965, the legal and social landscape had changed enough that the Historical Society refused. The journal and letter were catalogued, though access was restricted to academic researchers who signed confidentiality agreements. Over the following decades, a handful of historians studied the documents, trying to verify Dinah's claims and determine how much of her story was truth versus elaboration or fantasy. The evidence, such as it is, remains ambiguous. Augustus Van Dorn definitely died of heart failure in April 1847. Constance Van Dorn definitely died of consumption a week earlier. Both deaths were thoroughly documented and witnessed by Dr. Clement Fairchild, whose own journals, discovered in the 1970s, corroborate the basic timeline and mention his suspicions about Augustus's cruelty, though he never witnessed it directly. The medical examiner's report on Augustus's death, unsealed in 1944 after the mandatory 97-year restriction expired, noted irregularities in cardiac tissue consistent with chronic digitalis exposure, though the examiner at the time attributed this to legitimate medical treatment rather than poisoning. Modern forensic experts who've reviewed the report say the digitalis levels would have been difficult to distinguish from intentional poisoning versus therapeutic use, given the medical knowledge of 1847. As for Constance's heart, there's no way to verify Dinah's claim. Constance was buried in a sealed casket that deteriorated decades ago. Her remains, such as they exist, have long since returned to the South Carolina soil. The only evidence is Dinah's testimony, Augustus's final journal entry, which cryptically references consuming that which I destroyed and the fact that Dinah's anatomical knowledge, gained from reading medical texts, would have made such a desecration technically possible. Bellwood Manor itself was destroyed by fire in 1863 during the Civil War's final years. Whether the fire was accidental or intentional remains unknown. The property stood abandoned for decades afterward, eventually subdivided and sold to developers. Today, a suburban neighborhood occupies the land where the manor once stood, and most residents have no idea that one of Charleston's darkest secrets played out beneath their feet. The Charleston Historical Society still maintains the sealed Van Dorn papers, though access has been gradually liberalized over the years. Researchers who've studied the documents remain divided about their authenticity. Some believe Dinah's account is substantially true, perhaps the most detailed first-hand testimony of domestic violence and enslaved resistance in antebellum America. Others suggest it's an elaborate fiction, a revenge fantasy written by a woman who'd endured decades of powerlessness and created an imaginary victory when none was possible in reality. Dr. Fairchild's journals offer tantalizing hints but no definitive answers. He wrote extensively about his guilt over failing to protect Constance, his suspicions about Augustus's cruelty, and his growing awareness that something deeply wrong was happening at Bellwood Manor. But he never explicitly confirmed Dinah's story. And his final entry, written days before his own death in 1853, suggests he'd convinced himself that whatever happened at Bellwood Manor was best left buried, some truths serve no purpose except to torture the living with guilt they cannot assuage. I will take my suspicions to the grave and pray that God judges me mercifully for my cowardice. The descendants of the Van Dorn family, now scattered across the country with various surnames from generations of marriage and remarriage, generally refuse to discuss the matter. Most claim ignorance of their connection to Augustus and Constance. A few have publicly stated that Dinah's account is fabricated slander designed to damage a respectable family's reputation. None have offered evidence to contradict the historical records, which, at minimum, confirm that Augustus Van Dorn was a wealthy planter who died shortly after his wife, that both deaths occurred under the circumstances Dinah described, and that sealed documents were deliberately hidden for a century. What happened at Bellwood Manor in 1847 remains one of American history's most disturbing mysteries. Not because we don't know the facts, but because the facts we have are almost too terrible to accept: a woman tortured for 30 years by the man who swore to cherish her, a servant who loved her mistress enough to commit murder, a promise so dark that it seems to belong to fiction rather than history, and a revenge so complete, so psychologically devastating, that it destroyed its target more thoroughly than any conventional murder ever could. The truth, as always, exists somewhere in the space between documented fact and oral testimony, between what we can prove and what we know in our bones must have happened. Dinah Colebrook served Augustus Van Dorn faithfully for 30 years, just as her story claims. What she served him during those final days, that question haunts everyone who studies the case. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most horrifying stories emerge not from supernatural evil, but from very human cruelty and the desperate measures people take to survive or resist it. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkest secrets of American history are often the ones we've deliberately chosen to forget. But at Liturgy of Fear, we believe they deserve to be remembered. See you in the next video.